Welcome to The Stationary Bandit, a show about legal history and state formation. And as always, today's interview does not reflect the views of the employers of either my guests or myself.
It's my pleasure to talk with David Friedman, the economist and legal scholar and anarcho-capitalist theorist. So I want to start by asking some basic questions that I still have some confusion about on the definition of government in your work. So, and the first edition of Machinery of Freedom, is it fair to say that your definition is pretty close to the classic Max Weber definition that the state is the institution that has the monopoly on the socially legitimate use of force within a given territory?
I think I can do better than that.
Okay.
The definition I had in the first edition was an agency of legitimized coercion. And that then raises two issues. What does legitimized mean and what does coercion mean?
Right.
And I think I had a reasonable intuition for that, but I make it much more explicit in the third edition, where I have a chapter which is in part on these questions. And the basic idea, it really goes back to territorial behavior by animals, that there are a fair number of animals, mostly birds and fishes, but some mammals, which are territorial. And what does that mean? That means that the animal marks the boundary of the territory he is claiming in some way. And then the way I like to think of it, turns a switch in his brain, somehow commits himself, so that if another member of the same species and gender trespasses on his territory, he will fight to the death to drive him off. And the critical fact is that a fight to the death is usually a loss for both parties. That unless the trespasser is much stronger, even if he wins, he's likely to get more injury than the amount at stake worth. So that gives you a very primitive kind of private property, as it were, defended only by a commitment strategy. And I then want to argue that the way of making sense of human societies, in a sense, the reason why we're not in Hobbes's war of each against all, is that human beings have a much fancier version of that. It's not limited to physical territory, but a human being has a set of commitment strategies which amount to saying, if you cross this line, I will bear unreasonably large costs to fight you. Not infinite costs. Obviously, you sometimes surrender. But if you try to steal something worth $10 from me, I will spend a good deal more than $10 trying to stop you. And that I then think, in a functioning society, people are aware of each other's lines so that your commitment strategies are consistent. There's a real problem if I'm committed to get something that you're permitted to not give me. But that's usually not the case. And then what I think I meant by initiating coercion at that time was crossing one of those lines. And what I meant by legitimized is it's an organization against which individuals drop their commitment strategy. So that the same activity that done by a private party would result in your bearing fairly large costs to prevent it, do not call out that response if done by a government. And I think that's the closest that I can come to explaining why we call some things governments and some not. You can't do it by what they do, because I think anything you can imagine a government doing is also done by organizations we won't think of as governments. My standard example is warfare. That if you think about the Danes who Alfred the Great was fighting, those were mostly not national armies. They were entrepreneurial projects. Basically, some Norse, Norwegian, or Danish, or maybe Swedish leader who had a good reputation said, hey, let's all go invade England and we can get them to pay us pay us off with Danegeld, or we can grab some land or something, or loot. So that's warfare being done privately, and I think there are other examples. And similarly, I think we've got lots of examples of private institutions for settling disputes, for enforcing rules, and so forth. So I think that the closest I can come to defining a government is my agency of legitimized coercion, remembering that both coercion and legitimized have special meanings there, which I did make clear in first edition.
Well, so I think what I'm stuck on with that is it seems to me that a lot of things that we wouldn't want to call states might still fit that bill. So I'm specifically thinking about, very tight social or religious cultures that might make, demands for a certain amount of tithes, or just demands that people do things. And they might be able to make these demands on members. And, I don't have a specific example to give here, but I could imagine the demand, if it's not met, people just coming and, taking some property from the member.
But a government, an employer makes demands on employees. However, they don't have a commitment strategy that says you can't wake me up at 3 a.m. If you're an employer who has agreed to pay me a salary in exchange for my being able to be woken up at 3 a.m. And it seems to me the same thing would apply there. It's tricky in a sense. You could say, well, look, I allow my landlord to do things I wouldn't allow somebody else to do. But it's not, I wouldn't allow your landlord to do that. So it's because I've got a particular relationship with him, and therefore I don't have a commitment strategy. My commitment strategy is to keeping my contracts, essentially, and not letting other people violate their contracts with me. It's not. So I don't think that's really a problem. Now, I'm sure that almost any bright line definition is going to have fuzzy bits, but I think this is at least the closest I can come. And then the reason I have to answer the question from my standpoint is because I claim to be an anarchist.
Right.
And then that requires me to define what a government is, because an anarchist is somebody who wants a society without government.
Right.
And I don't want a society without mechanisms for enforcing rights. But to take the very simplest case, going back to my animals with territorial behavior, that's a mechanism for enforcing rights. It's not as good a mechanism as you might want, but the territorial animal is enforcing his right to control a particular piece of land by his commitment strategy. And there are lots of things in between that and a government which can be used to enforce rights. And I at least argue that I can give examples of past societies where rights were enforced by private action without government getting involved, and that I can at least sketch a plausible account of a modern society that worked that way. And that's what sort of the relevant section of my first book is about.
Right. I want to push on this a little bit more, though, because I feel like I still don't see, a clear distinction here. Is it, you drop some amount of your commitment strategies against, your employer. And is the difference kind of the number of things, the number of ways that relationship can make demands on you?
The difference is that the reason I drop it against my employer is that I don't have a commitment strategy towards not dropping it. But in the case of if you really believe in a social contract, then in some sense that wouldn't really be a government. But we don't really. A social contract is a metaphor. It may be a useful metaphor. Maybe I think peace treaty is a more useful metaphor for what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. But if you say, yes, I have agreed, I suppose in principle, if I imagine an immigrant to the country who accepts the idea that the government has moral authority, mm-hmm. and who therefore says, yes, I agree that I will pay my taxes, mm-hmm. and I will serve on juries, mm-hmm. and then that would not be coercion from that case. But most of us are not in that situation. That most of us are people who are have the rules imposed on us and choose not to fight them.
Right. Well, I guess then the example that I'm curious, like, is there a clean distinction would be, let's say someone who grows up in a very tight-knit religious community like the ultra-Orthodox or the Amish, and, you know, this society is able to make a lot of demands on them. And it is true, they could exit.
The Amish is exactly the opposite. In the case of the Amish, somebody who grows up Amish is not obligated to obey any of the Amish rules until as an adult he promises to.
Right.
The Amish are anarchists. They're
right.
very rule-oriented anarchists, but they're anarchists.
Okay, so I guess, you know, maybe they weren't a good specific example, but if there is a religious group where, I mean, I guess even still saying, you know, nominally, you know, by staying you're agreeing, there is, you know, some people make that claim just by, you know, not leaving the U.S. You know, yes. you are agreeing.
That requires that you believe that the U.S. government has the sorts of rights that you think you have to your own property, or your neighbor has to his property. And maybe if you believe that, then it's not clear. But it I guess I'd only say it doesn't feel like that, because they can decide, they can change the tax law. Your employer can change how much he's paying you, but only with your having the right to quit if you don't accept the cut in the wages or the increase in the amount of work you have to do. But no, I wouldn't be astonished if there have been religious groups that really were governments, but I don't think they're automatically that, and I don't think a close-knit family, which is, I think, what you're really getting to more nearly, has that characteristic that you're free to leave, you don't choose to leave. Anyway,
do
you have a better definition of a government? What's a government?
No, I don't. I mean, I wonder how much it is a well-definable concept generally, how much we have to define it just by kind of pointing at the things that are kind of obviously government-y like, and how well we're going to do with any definition. But I mean, I think yours is as good of a kind of starting point, and to the extent that there's going to be some fuzziness in any definition, and that any definition is there are going to be some cases that will probably be called governments that aren't exactly what we think of as governments, but that's just the nature of defining, you know, social objects anyway. I did wanted to ask about, you mentioned the peace treaty concept, which you bring up again in, I think, maybe the second or third edition of Machinery of Freedom, the idea of the social contract being, in effect, a peace treaty between the different individuals and groups and societies based on their relative coercive powers and their different interests. And that seems right to me, but I'm curious how it fits into the vision of a kind of possible anarcho-capitalist future. Would that still be the case in some basic sense, that society still has a peace treaty like that and it's just a better one? Or is there some way in which in an anarcho-capitalist society it would not be correct to decide to...
No, it's still a peace treaty, because after all, there will be people in that society who believe that abortion is murder. It might turn out that in the equilibrium of that society, there are no rights enforcement agencies that in fact enforce a law against abortion. And from the standpoint of those people, they ought to be able to punish people who abort their children, but they recognize they don't have the power to do it. So I think in that sense, maybe my system is even more explicitly that, because in my system, nobody claims that you have to actually agree with the laws that you're under. They just have to be the best deal you can get. Uh,
Right.
and it is a more nearly competitive version, since you can choose among multiple rights enforcement agencies, but there still may be no rights enforcement agency that gives you what you want, what you think you're entitled to.
Right. So, in some sense, would it be fair to say that you think there is? I mean, is this still a version of kind of social contract theory? Because I think in a very naive way.
Except the point, to me, the point of social contract theory is to claim that you're morally obliged to obey a contract because you've agreed to it. And I don't think you're really morally obliged to obey a peace treaty. I think it's prudent to obey peace treaties. It's probably good for people to have a prejudice against breaking peace treaties. But if you're really in a situation where your country has been conquered by a much more powerful neighbor, and then by good fortune, the neighbor gets into a fight with somebody more powerful than you are, and there's an opportunity, and I do not think that the Finns were acting unjustly when they retook territory that the Soviets had taken from them in the Russo-Finnish War.
Right.
They were taking advantage of the fact that the Russians were now fighting the Germans, and under those circumstances didn't have the resources to fight the Finns, and so the Finns basically, I think roughly speaking, they went back to their previous boundary and stopped.
Right.
And that's a violation of a peace treaty, but I don't think it was evil.
Right. Right. So it's more just it's a social contract theory purely based on prudence rather than moral obligation.
Yep.
That makes sense. So I want to ask some questions about your most recent book. The legal society, or the legal system, is very different from our own. That is your most recent book, right?
Correct.
Okay. So is it fair to say that all of the stateless societies that you are familiar with are pretty tightly based on strong kinship networks?
Huh. That's interesting. To begin with, the book isn't mainly about stateless societies. There are some of the societies in it are stateless.
Right.
I'm just thinking about whether that's really true. That in the Icelandic system, it is certainly true that families are coalitions, but there are often coalitions that go beyond the family. And you can have people, the person who ends up avenging Njal and his family is, if I remember correctly, a son-in-law, not bloodkin at all. The person who more or less saves Egil when Egil is more or less at the mercy of his enemy, Arnbjorn, is, I think, not a relative of Egil at all. He's just Egil's best friend, who Egil has done very good things for in the past. And so I think kinship is certainly important in that system. Now, if I think about the Romani, the Vlach Rom system, they certainly have strong families. And I don't know. I'm trying to think of there's a description of a feud in a modern Vlach Rom in America, in one of the things I read, and I just don't know if all of the people on one side are related to each other's. So I think that kinship in practice is there. It's a structure. If you think, let me take the Somali case. Mm-hmm. Because Somali is a case where the default structure is kinship, specifically agnostic kinship. The Somali system is really quite neat. You have any individual is a member of a set of nested coalitions. So default rule is that the smallest coalition is the other descendants in the male line of his grandfather. The next coalition up is basically the same thing for his great-grandfather and so forth. However, it doesn't have to be that. and they actually have the term a pile of shields. And a pile of shields is a non-kinship coalition. And I thought it was rather neat. That was their term for the Western alliance against the Soviets.
Right.
That from their stand, fitting it into their system, as it were. So that's a case where the default rule is kinship, but they recognize the fact that you can have non-kinship ones, where basically it's a pile of shields, means a coalition where you've gotten enough people who do not have the appropriate kinship relations so that they can fight a feud. So.
Right. Is in the pile of shields, though, are they kind of imagined as autonomous actors, or is it more like a coalition of different kinship groups, like small kinship groups that are able to kind of make a larger group contractually?
Could be either, but there's an explicit contract.
Mm-hmm.
I think I actually quote in the book from my source, who was a London School of Economics anthropologist, who was sort of the expert on that system. Quite neat. And he has a contract that basically this was at the point when the Britain was nominally in charge of northern Somalia. And so they deposited their contract with the local British official. And the contract specified sort of a bunch of things about the relations among them.
Yeah, and that feels similar to Icelandic. I feel like I can't totally do the catalog in my head right now, but in the book it feels like most of these systems, the kind of explicitly stateless ones, there is a kind of base kinship plus a somewhat contractual mechanism. I guess in Icelandic law, would there be kind of a contractual mechanism of bringing together coalitions, or is it more of an informal mechanism?
I think that's informal. There's a sense in that is the legal system recognizes kinship in the sense that if you kill somebody, it's his kin who have a claim against you.
Right.
And that's true in lots of systems. If you look at Islamic law, where I think I wouldn't call it stateless, but it's certainly got elements of, and under Islamic, not necessarily the law of current Muslim societies, but in traditional Islamic law, if you kill somebody, the claim against the people who are responsible for doing something about it are his kin. They can choose to not do anything. They can choose to accept monetary compensation. And if you killed him in sort of the first-degree murder kind of sense rather than an auto accident or equivalent, they can insist on killing you.
Right.
But they don't have to. They can accept what the Icelanders would call wergeld, dia.
Right. I mean,
in exchange instead, and there are even remnants of that in Jewish law, although it's less clear there. But no, traditional Islamic law is really quite neat, because one of the things I like is the fact that taxes don't have to go to the government.
Right.
That basically, your religious tax has to go to certain purposes, and you can give it to the government to spend on those purposes, or you can spend it on those purposes yourself, or you can give it to somebody who, for I think a 10% share, will distribute it for you.
And do you think that freedom was actually kind of realized in practice, or was it kind of a grooves of expectation?
A lot of the Islamic law stuff, you get. It probably depends when and where, but I think a lot of it you get actual governments which are going over. There's an anecdote about the second caliph, Umar, that it goes back to an anecdote about the first caliph, Abu Bakr, but basically that he's sitting in front of his doorstep with some of his friends, and a beautiful girl goes by who's a slave. She's presumably a captive at some point or other, and one of his friends says that's a beautiful girl. She would look very well in the bed of the caliph. And Umar says, Allah forfend, she is not lawful to me. Why is she not lawful to you? Because she's the property of the Muslims. But you are the caliph of the Muslims. So what then is or is not lawful to you of the property of the Muslims? That I can tell you. And this goes back to the anecdote about Abu Bakr. But basically, I'm entitled to one garment in summer and one garment in winter, and others to replace them when those wear out of it. And one exile's pension, not that of a great man or of a little man, but of the middling sort. And I think it's one sheep a day to feed my family. That is all I'm entitled to of the treasure of the Muslims. But then his successor has a much broader view of the subject, and most of the caliphs do. But you still see scenes much later where a caliph is inviting a holy man to eat with him or something, and makes a point of the fact that the food was bought with income that the caliph himself earned. There was a sort of a custom that the caliph was supposed to have some profession, as it were. So at the same time that you get all of these stories of enormous wealth that they were getting through ruling, there was still a sort of a theory that, as the English, medieval English would say, that the king should live of his own.
Right. Right.
So anyway, but yeah, no, the Ottomans are a fairly extreme case, because the Ottomans theoretically are following religious law, except there's a second law code, which is basically pronouncements by the caliph, by the sultan, and which in theory is just filling out the gaps, but in fact they're sometimes inconsistent. That the religious law is generally interpreted did not permit interest charges, whereas the Qanun, the sultanic law, has a maximum interest rate.
Right. Right. I want to ask some questions about your comments on the feudal. Or not feudal, the feud origins of a lot of legal systems. Yes. And I want to get a sense of how that works theoretically for you. So is it your sense that basically all legal systems, as far as you can tell, everything that you've seen, starts with this basically? I don't know
enough. I don't know enough. In particular, I don't have a clear picture of the origins of Chinese, or for that matter, Japanese law. I think there is good reason to believe, though it's hard to be certain, that Islamic law, Jewish law, Anglo-American common law, and probably Roman law start as feud systems and then develop on from there. And I suppose insofar as Napoleonic code comes out of anything, it's coming out of Roman law ultimately. So in that sense it does, although it's more nearly than the others a creation. But yeah, I think that's right. It's very hard to be sure because they don't have the information, and I could be wrong. But you certainly see features in Jewish law and Islamic law which look an awful lot like they're, as it were, fossils of feud law.
Right. And would you say the basic makeup of a feud law system is you've got a kinship network and a basic rule of vengeance or payment in the alternative? Is that?
I don't think it has to be a kinship network. I think the ones I know seem to be.
Okay.
But in terms of the internal logic of it, I would say the basic logic of it is that individuals have beliefs about what they're entitled to, as it were, have a commitment strategy that they will, this is going back to what I was saying before, have a commitment strategy that they will bear large costs in order to get that. And the result is that if somebody, from your standpoint, violates your rights, you demand compensation and are willing to use violence if he doesn't give you compensation. And I have a discussion in one chapter in that of what are the problems that such a system has to solve. And one of them is the commitment strategy. You need some way that you don't just back down when the other guy says, well, I'll use violence against you. You need some way of trying to remember how I put it in terms of four. One of the things you need is some way of enforcing the rights of people who don't have power, who don't have much power. Some mechanism. And my favorite example of that is the Icelandic system, because basically what you do if somebody does something so you're entitled to sue him for lots of money, but you know that if you try to sue him, you'll get beaten up on the way to the court, essentially, is you transfer your claim to somebody else who won't get beaten up on the way to the court, and he maybe gives you some of the money, maybe doesn't, but at least the person who's violated your rights ends up paying for it.
Right.
And you need so you need some mechanism such that the threat to use violence can't be used for extortion as well as it can be used for justice. So that you need some way, as I put it, some way such that right makes might.
Right.
Some reason why when somebody really has violated your rights, you will find it easier to use this mechanism than if he hasn't.
Right.
And that typically, I think, involves some way in which lots of third parties know which you're doing, and people are willing to ally with you if you're on the right side and reluctant to ally with you when you're in the wrong. And of course, it doesn't work perfectly, obviously.
Right.
Sure, people do sometimes get away with extortion, but none of the systems we know about, including ours, work perfectly.
Right.
And then you need some way of terminating feud, because one of the dangers is if both of us think we're in the right, then you refuse to pay me off, and so I use force against you and burn your house or something. Now you think that I violated your rights, so you want to use force against me if I don't compensate. It goes back and forth. And so you need some mechanism for terminating those. And I think the real systems generally have mechanisms for terminating them. Anyway.
Right. So in the book, I know you look at these systems as, you want to look at them as basically stable, successful things, and not just, assume that because they're in the past, they've been superseded in some serious way. But I am curious, looking at a bunch of these systems, especially the feud ones, which are mostly gone now, do you have did you develop any sort of general thoughts on why feud systems end? Is it mostly just powerful states come along and stop them?
No, I think it probably depends on the particular case. Mm-hmm. That it's pretty clear what happens with the Icelandic system, but not entirely clear why. That what happens with the Icelandic system is that initially you've got about 40 Gothar, which are normally translated chieftains, but that's rather misleading because they don't really have tribes or clans that they're chieftains of. And they have a set of rights such that you plug into the legal system through a Gothi, and you can choose any Gothi who will have you, basically. And you can change it, I think, once a year. I think there's only a particular day in the year or month in the year or something you can change it. And over 200 or so years, you end up in a situation where a single coalition, single family coalition, controls a bunch of the rights to be a Gothi. So that instead of 40 players, you maybe have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 players. And it's not entirely clear why that happens. But the result is that then in the final 50 years, the Sturlung period, you have a situation where what they're fighting about is less that you violated my rights and haven't paid me off, and more that I want to dominate Iceland, and you want to dominate Iceland. It's not that simple, but that's what it looks like. And of course, one of the things that keeps it, that in a sense stabilizes it for a while, is that families break up, so that you have a case in which two different members of the same family are fighting each other. But part of what may be going on is intervention by a state, because Norway wants Iceland, and the King of Norway is supporting one person or another in these civil conflicts. Part of what one of my conjectures is that it's a result of Christianity, because when Iceland goes Christian, you end up with a situation where the local landowner who has provided the land for a church ends up in a position where you can collect part of the tithes that are paid for the church, and that gives you something that's sort of like taxes, and that maybe makes it possible for larger groups to form. But I don't really know. I mean, I've got various conjectures about it. But the Somali system, it broke down when England and Italy created the country of Somalia, and various foreign people tried to make it function as a country, and that worked very badly. It ended up with a dictator and a civil war, and lots of other, and a war with Ethiopia and various other things. And other than that, I don't know what happened in the Jewish or the Anglo-Saxon case. I think you can see the pattern, but I'm not sure that I don't know enough to know what the early steps are. That is, what's the point at which you get a king, so to speak. I don't have the feeling that the Anglo-Saxons who invaded England had kings. They had military leaders. Horsa and Hengist are the famous ones. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't say that I really have a theory of it. That's an interesting stuff. But really, the book is not mainly about theories. The book is mainly, isn't it interesting to look at all the different ways that people have solved the same set of problems?
Right. Well, so I've got a question here that might be a little bit out of how you think about these things, because it sounds like, I mean, when I was reading the book, just the existence of clans and kinship networks to most of these systems, especially the feud systems and the stateless systems, that stuck out to me, and it sounds like maybe it's less obviously conceptually important for you, but a question that jumped out to me, which you might just have thoughts on as someone who reads a lot of medieval history generally, is I'm curious, have you encountered the work of people like Joe Henrich much on? So do you know who he is? So he's an anthropologist at Harvard, and with a number of economic historians,
Is he the person who you sent me
yes.
an article, some of which I read, but nothing like all of it, because it was a long article.
Right.
And he is arguing, perhaps correctly, that there is a correlation between kinship societies, where his main measure is the amount of cousin marriage,
right, and
things like how individualistic and a bunch of other things of that sort. People are in a society, and he's got lots of data and lots of correlations, and he may, for all I know, be right, but it's not something that I really know anything about.
Right. Well, and it sounds like you haven't thought about it much before, so the answer might be that this is too off the top of your head. But I'm curious. I mean, what I was struck reading the book and thinking about a connection of, it seems like these feud systems work well in, very strong kinship situations where you have these coalitions, but maybe in societies where some institution like the Catholic Church, in his example, has broken this down, you end up getting rid of the kinship groups as a kind of like main organ of society that organizes kind of responsible relationships, and by which you can figure out.
But it doesn't have to be a
disputes.
kinship group.
Right.
I have a quote from somebody on medieval stuff, and it's not stuff I know a lot about. But what he's basically saying is that the normal medieval situation, and I'm not sure how late he's counting, is one where what's really going on is a feud system, even though you have a king and nominally the king's law. Mm-hmm. And in that, the players of the feud might be a monastery.
Right.
And I argue, I think I have in the book, that if you think about litigation among high-tech companies, mm-hmm. that there's an element of the same logic of feud law, that I can sue you on the claim that you have violated my intellectual property, and you can sue me, and to some extent, what limits the amount to which you do that is that other person can sue you in retaliation. So I have a discussion of that, and I don't remember the details anymore. But so I think you need players, and you could imagine the case where the player is a single person. Now, the one disadvantage of the player being a single person is he can get killed. Mm-hmm. So that one of the points I make in my discussion of the requirements for a feud law system to work is that you need not only a commitment strategy that binds you, but a commitment strategy that survives death.
Right.
And the way you do that is that your kin inherit your claim, and therefore, if you're killed, they not only have your original claim, they also got the claim for the weregild for killing you. And I could certainly imagine a future society in which that was all contractual, in which you and I agree that we'll be each other's heirs. And if either of us gets killed in a feud, the other one then inherits his claim. That somebody should do a science fiction story along those lines. It would be fun.
Right.
But
well, so I want to ask a bit on this line about the ways you think these stateless systems could play out in the future. And I was wondering, I sent you that blog post by Robin Hanson. I don't know, did you get a chance to look at that?
No, I read that.
Okay. And I'm curious, because I know you've known Robin for a long time, and you two, read each other's work. I'm curious how different Robin's view of the future here is from yours, because in some sense, it seems kind of broadly similar, and that you both are saying, we could devolve a lot of, legal functions away from nation states into these groups. And he's thinking primarily in terms of, these voucher groups that would kind of hold you responsible. You think primarily in terms of these protection groups. And it seems they would have a lot of the same functions, but maybe is there really just a single different rule between the two of you, which is that he would force people to have some voucher company, whereas you would say if someone's, fully irresponsible and doesn't get a protection group, then they are at the mercy of the other protection groups?
Yeah, that is to say, but I'm not sure that Robin would deny that. That is, I don't know. I've never discussed this with him, but I would have thought that in his system, I could choose to be somebody who had nobody who vouched for me, but nobody might be willing to do business with me. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, there's a sense you can certainly see a libertarian version of his argument, right, in which you say, well, look, it's just that I'm entitled not to have you testing nuclear weapons if you're my neighbor. And if I carry that far enough, we can say, well, you have the potential to injure me in various ways. So therefore, in order for you to be close to me where you could injure me, you must have some way of guaranteeing that you can compensate me if you do. And that libertarians tend to think in much too bright line ways, as if there is a sharp line between coercing and not coercing. But of course, every time that you turn on a light, you're sending photons to trespass on somebody else's property. So it really is sort of a fuzzy boundary. And I don't think I'd be in favor of that system, but I could certainly see an argument for somebody saying, look, if you want other people not to force you to move 10 miles away from them because they regard your being close as the equivalent of pointing a gun at them, then you've got to have some mechanism for demonstrating to them that you can be trusted, so to speak. So it isn't my version, but Robin's a very bright guy.
Right. Sorry. So what would you say is your kind of like your main disagreement, or just the way that you see yours as being kind of fundamentally different?
I'd have to argue with him for that.
Okay, but is it just that or is one maybe
that is, I don't in fact think that people are sufficiently dangerous to other people so that in order to exist you have to have somebody vouching for you. That it seems to me a adequate system is if you really are a irresponsible person who doesn't think about what he does, pretty soon you kill somebody and then his relatives kill you and that takes care of you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, after all, in all of these systems, the alternative to your paying the damages is you're getting killed.
Right.
Sometimes exiled, but depending on how serious the matter is. So in that sense, that gives you an alternative way of, and so in my system, if you are somebody who doesn't sign up with any rights enforcement agency, that's fine. As long as you don't get into any conflicts with people, you're fine. You're saving the cost of the rights enforcement agency. If you do get into a conflict with somebody, and you refuse to accept arbitration that he's willing to agree to, and you end up with violent conflict, and you probably get killed.
Yeah.
Or else he grabs whatever's property of yours that compensates him or whatever. And that seems to me to adequately do the same thing that Robin wants to do by saying that because lots of people can't be trusted, therefore. On the other hand, I agree that you don't let a 2-year-old walk out into the highway. So in that sense, I would agree that there are some people who you do not treat as people, as it were, well, you treat them as people in some ways.
You treat them as adults.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the basic argument against saying, well, we'll decide which people are smart enough to be adults is that there's no bright line.
Right.
There's no good Schelling point. So that in principle, if it was really the case that your IQ was written on your forehead, you could argue if the number is less than 70, we shouldn't treat you as a human being. We treat you as a smart chimpanzee. But it isn't written on your forehead, and other people have good reasons why they would want to treat you as somebody who doesn't have rights because there's conflicts between you and them. And therefore, I think you're better off having a mechanism in which everybody is assumed to be an adult. And if the result of your being sufficiently non-adult is that you do something which injures people, well, you end up owing compensation. And if you don't pay the compensation, you end up being locked up or killed or whatever that particular society does. So I don't see that as a serious problem.
No, that makes sense. Okay, following up on that, I wanted to throw a couple perhaps ill-formed questions at you, but I'll give you the general thought that I'm wondering about first, which is that I wonder when, particularly when I read, and I understand that legal system very different from our own. That book isn't supposed to say, oh, we can directly bring all these ideas into the future
right,
or anything like that. But I definitely think that part of the project, and I think you say this explicitly, does fit in with your general kind of anarcho-capitalist theorizing, that there are some stateless systems in the past that have made these things work, and you could imagine things working in the future using somewhat similar.
But it's not just the anarchist stuff. That is that a majority of the societies whose legal systems we're looking at are not stateless.
Right.
Iceland is not fully stateless. It's what I think of as a semi-stateless system. because enforcement is private, but there is a single law code and a
Right.
single court system. So one of the things that I'm doing in the book at the end of it is saying, are there ideas here that we could imitate?
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are at least some ideas that it might make sense. I'm a law professor as well as as an anarchist, and am interested in legal systems, not just stateless legal systems.
Right. Right. Well, so one thing I wanted to ask about specifically on the kind of thinking about stateless ones, and in terms of like what, or I guess this is anarcho-capitalist theory generally. When you were saying that we don't need to force someone to, on Robin's model, like someone who's really irresponsible and ends up killing someone. I think the example you said is, eventually, maybe their relatives will, the relatives of the victim will end up killing that person, and that kind of is how that gets sorted out. I'm curious, like, does that seem psychologically plausible? I guess I have this, kind of one of the voices in the background of my head is, some mixture of a kind of Steven Pinker, Brian Kaplan, or, Joseph Henrich, like these people who really do think there has been a lot of kind of cultural, psychological change, in the last few hundred years that maybe has to do with breaking down kinship networks, things like this. But the idea that, that we would kind of eventually have the backstop of just killing someone, or just, allowing our...
But the mechanism doesn't have to be kinship.
Mm-hmm.
That after all, in the system that I sketch in my book, the equivalent of your kinship network is instead a rights enforcement agency. It's a private corporation which is selling you a service, which has strong incentives to carry out that service because it wants the reputation so other people will be willing to be its customers. So I think the same logic works whether it's kinship or corporations or various other kinds of systems.
Mm-hmm. And I guess one, question again on psychological plausibility there that I've kind of wondered about is this is a very dumbed down version of how Robin Hanson thinks or talks about things, but he, when he talks about healthcare, one of his psychological points is just that we very deeply don't like using market mechanisms for distributing medicine because we have this kind of group allegiance thing that we would rather be doing with our health decisions. And I wonder about, rights enforcement and kind of basic violence provision. Is that something where, does it sound plausible to you to be concerned that we might just psychologically have kind of a hard barrier where, human history, like we so thoroughly have this sense that our kinship network or maybe our nation is, kind of like what should rightfully be dealing with violence in these kind of basic disputes, that maybe there's a kind of like, like the way, the commitment strategy dropping thing might be very deeply arranged around specific groups that might be hard to slot protection brackets or protection organizations into that role. That was a
why is it any harder to slot them in than to slot a government in?
I think
they're both somebody who's not related to you.
Right.
The rights enforcement agency, in a sense, feels a little bit closer to you.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Have you read by any chance Werner Vinge's short story, The Ungoverned?
I have not.
Vinge was a very good science fiction writer. He's not alive, unfortunately. And that story, he says at the end that he's borrowing his society from me.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a novelist version of the society, not an economist version.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody sort of takes for granted their institutions. There's a very neat bit where the story is basically a stateless society being invaded by an adjacent state.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both pretty small. And the stateless society, I think, is richer, but the state has got military and so forth. And part of what happens is that in the stateless society, there are people who are referred to as armadillos. And an armadillo is your person who does not choose to be part of the network of contracts.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a particular armadillo who was a wealthy farmer whose son lost a legal dispute like 20 years earlier, and he thinks that was wrong. So he is not signatory to any of these agreements. And he simply armed his farm defensively.
Mm-hmm.
And the invading army runs into that farm. And it never occurs to them that they can walk around it.
Mm-hmm. Because
from their standpoint, a fortress is obviously part of the enemy's defensive system.
Right.
And there's a representative of the local rights enforcement agency who I think is a prisoner of the invading army at this point and is talking with them. And it turns out that his last-ditch defensive mechanism was an atomic bomb.
Mm-hmm.
He's got a very deep tunnel for his family. And when the army finally destroys his defenses, which are substantial because it's a richer society and he's put all his money into this, but the army is stronger than that is, he detonates a nuclear weapon and takes out like a third of the army. And the, I guess, commander of the invading army says to the rights enforcement agency, "What kind of slime are you using nukes against us?" And this is a society where everybody's strongly anti-nuke. And he looks at him with sort of puzzled expression and says, "What do you mean us? He's not our customer." And I thought it was neat in suggesting the way in which in any society people take for granted the set of institutions they're used to living under. And another science fiction story by two other writers, Niven and Purnell, it's called Oath of Fealty. And that's one where the point is that if you have a private institution which is doing the equivalent of government and providing the same services to people, its customers will think of it as a government in the sense of owing fealty to it, of feeling as though it's us and them. Mm-hmm. And so this is one in which in Oath of Fealty you have essentially a single building city, small city, that's been built in a part of Los Angeles that was burned out in a riot at some point in the past, and it's financed by a European consortium, I think. But it's got a deal with the city and state and federal government that basically its people don't pay taxes directly. It pays itself a tribute to the authorities, and more or less everything is taken care of by them. And they think, and the people living there, as it were, think of the people around them in Los Angeles as foreigners. Mm-hmm. A sequence of events happens which results in the deputy head of the building, as it were, getting arrested and in jail in Los Angeles. And it is a sequence which, from the standpoint of the people in the building, he was doing the right thing. He was protecting us. And from the standpoint of the LA authorities, he was doing something wrong. And the, I guess, viewpoint character, who's a reporter who's been covering all of this, says to the head of the building, "If you'll let me come along, I won't tell." Mm-hmm. What will you tell? That you're going to break him out. How do you know we're going to break him out? Because all your people expect you to. That from their standpoint, it's not a miscarriage of justice. It's a foreign country who members of whom tried to blow up their building. In the process of stopping it, some people got killed, and they want to arrest our people for doing that. So it's a very neat point of the way in which people adjust to their set of institutions. So I don't think there would be any particular difficulty if these things existed, but they have to exist.
No, I like what was that story called?
It's a novel. It's called Oath of Fealty.
Oath of Fealty.
It's by Larry Niven and Jerry Purnell.
All right.
Purnell was a friend of mine. I've met Niven, but I didn't know him. Purnell's no longer alive. Niven, I think, is.
All right.
Niven is probably the best idea person in modern science fiction.
Yeah. That's what my dad always said. He's a very big Niven fan.
And Purnell, I think, may be a better storyteller than Niven. So their combined things are really pretty good. The I'm not sure I've seen anything by Niven recently that I liked, but
All right.
the what?
Do you have another 15 minutes or so? Because I want to
Sure.
ask. Okay. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions, or the couple last topics I wanted to get to are first
Yeah.
some AI stuff, and then some questions about personal and intellectual history. The AI stuff will be quick. I was re-looking at Future Imperfect before this, and the AI section in there is pretty short, so I kind of wanted, and then I looked at your Substack as well, and so I kind of wanted to just get a sense of, there's so much kind of loose talk about the agentic AIs that are coming, and how we're going to need so many new legal institutions to make sense of them and let them loose to really produce their value. And I'm curious if you just have any kind of basic thoughts about that. Like, are there institutions you expect to see pop up somewhere in the world in the next 5 years, giving the models we have? Or
Depends on what the AI turn out to be.
right.
That is, I made the point in Future Imperfect that a lot of people are making now, that there is the potential for catastrophic results.
Right.
Basically, because you might end up sharing the world with people who are much smarter than we are.
Right.
And as I put it then, we better hope they like pets.
Right.
But unlike a lot of especially the rationalists and the people associated with that, I think the world is much more uncertain than they think it is.
Right.
My younger son basically thinks the world's going to end in a few years because of AI.
Okay.
And it's possible.
Yeah.
But I don't think one knows nearly, and this is true in lots of areas, that I think people greatly overestimate how confident you can be about. I mean, that was part of the point of A Future Imperfect,
Right.
that I pretty much limited myself to 30 years out on the grounds that beyond that things get. And that's part of one of my criticisms of a lot of the climate stuff.
Right.
Is when somebody publishes an article in Nature estimating the cost from CO2 summed for the next 3 centuries, that's obviously fraud.
Right.
It's hard to believe that they even believe what they're doing.
Right.
Because so many of the costs involved depend on things like technology. And, we don't know what technology is going to do in 50 years, let alone 250.
Yeah. No, that was, that was one of my big viewquake moments personally, was in a master's program. I was writing a thesis about climate change and just read William Nordhaus's book, which is not weird quackery, it's very mainstream stuff. And if you just read that book, you realize, like, oh, this is, the way people talk about this stuff is just completely out of line with like what the actual best information is out there. And it's just like incredibly speculative. But just going back to the AI stuff, let's say, we're not dead in the next 10 years. These models get maybe a little bit better and a little bit more. You can give them tasks.
I think if they're what they are now, they are probably still going to be treated as property of people. The question is, if they start acting as if they're people.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody creates an AI and that AI clearly has purposes of its own, is taking actions, is making deals with people and so forth, then you get a really interesting situation. And I discuss a little of that in Future Imperfect, because you then have a society with people who are very different from us.
Right.
And I don't know what's going to happen in that case, but that would be interesting. But there's also there is the thing is, we don't even understand our consciousness.
Right.
There's a sense in which the strongest argument against my view of the world, which is basically an atheist sort of physicist's view of the world, physicist economist view of the world, is that I do not understand how there is somebody looking out my eyes.
Right.
All right. I can explain you fine as a robot, but that's not really believable because I know that I'm not a robot and you seem a lot like me.
Right.
Uh, and so if you want to sort of part of the reason that I'm not sure that religion is wrong, although I think it is wrong, is that there really is a soul, and I don't know what it is,
Right.
uh, uh,
Well,
but it's
well,
there.
well.
But
So
but
for
that
the AI,
that then gets it gets to the question of uh, artificial intelligence that's people. Since we don't understand why we're people,
right,
it might turn out that it's impossible. You
right,
know, maybe God didn't give them souls. Uh, it might turn out that that consciousness is just a somehow in some way to understand a consequence of having a sufficiently complicated computer, and that's we did it.
right.
Uh, the doesn't have to be that complicated. It seems to me that dogs and cats are pretty clearly conscious too, even if we don't treat them that way
Right.
always.
But for humans, we can't be 100% sure that other humans are conscious, right? We know that about ourselves. So in
Right.
principle, it seems like for AIs, we don't necessarily need to know that they're conscious to start having, to start needing legal rules where it's like, well, they act a lot like people. We might need to start for kind of legal
We
institutional
might.
reasons, start. And like, I guess I'm, last question on this. I'm just curious, like, what are the things you would need to see to think like, okay, our institutions really need to start dealing with these as people. We need to start changing how we're working here.
Well, I guess one of the things would be if there was some country which did,
Right.
and the result was that they got a whole lot out of their AIs than we got out of ours.
Right.
That there's a sense in which the argument against slavery is it doesn't work very well,
Right.
uh, and uh, so that would certainly be one reason to try to construct a legal which you could treat them as actors with rights. Uh, but I don't know.
No, that makes sense. Um, well, I do you mind if I just ask you some kind of rapid fire
That's
intellectual
fine.
personal history
Sure.
questions? All right. So the first one is the Icelandic legal history stuff. So that I first saw that in your writings, but it is something that people just in legal academia talk about now. Is that something? Is that basically from you? Are you the person who brought Icelandic legal history into the legal academy, or was that out in the water somewhere?
I don't think it was in the water. The way in which I got into doing economic analysis of law, which was not what I was doing in my early part of my career, was that two of the law school people at the University of Chicago, Landis and Posner, had, well, first two of the economists at Chicago, Becker and Stigler,
Right.
had written an article that was in effect proposing to privatize law enforcement in the sense of having a system where instead of a policeman being on a salary to the government, when the policeman got the evidence that convicted somebody, he collected the fine that the criminal had paid. That's a simplification, but that's the basic scheme.
Right.
And Landis and Posner wrote a critique of that, which made a number of points, some of them correct, some of them incorrect. The correct point was that, in a sense, what Becker and Stigler were doing was reinventing tort law.
Right.
Uh, and one of the things that I found interesting, I spent a chapter on in Law's Order, is why we have two systems doing the same work and what their differences are and why. And I got interested in that. I was at VPI at the time, and it occurred to me that I knew of a system, of a society that had something along the lines of what Becker and Stigler were proposing, namely Saga period Iceland. So I read up on that what I could. That was at that point Gragos, which is the surviving collection of laws, had not yet been translated, and I don't read Old Norse, so
Right.
but I could read the sagas which had been translated, and I could read some stuff about Gragos by people others about it and so forth.
So
And
you had
and
just. Oh, sorry.
so I wrote an article and submitted it to their journal. And I wrote a different article, which was a theoretical article, which had nothing to do with Iceland, but which was essentially a demonstration that one of the points that Landis and Posner had made was wrong.
Right.
That the problem which they claimed was insoluble could in fact be solved by a simple tweak in the assumed institutions. And that was fun. And Landis and Posner proposed that I come to Chicago to argue with them at closer range. And I ended up spending 8 or 9 years on a 1-year position as a faculty fellow at Chicago.
Oh yeah, I didn't realize you were there that long. What was the 8 or 9 year range?
I was here at Chicago Law School, roughly speaking, from 1986 to 1995.
Okay.
Although I took 1 year I was at Cornell in law school in between that, but that was roughly the period, and that was fun. It was an intellectually lively environment. But it eventually became clear that Landis and Posner were not going to be able to persuade their colleagues that they needed another economist as a tenured member of the faculty.
Right.
And then Santa Clara University was looking for somebody to doing law and economics, and I knew an economist there who was a Becker student who was a neat person, so I ended up coming out here. And also my family was out here already.
Right. So just going back to the Icelandic thing, though. So you said that you read this article and you knew of this system where that existed. You just knew that from reading the sagas, or like how did you know that?
Right. I mean, I've had an avocational interest in the Middle Ages for a very long time. I've been in the Society for Creative Anachronism for something over 50 years now.
Okay.
And that was probably the context, but I'm really not sure. It's long enough ago. But one of the things I do in the SCA is medieval storytelling, and the sagas are one of the things you can mine for bits that you can tell as stories,
right?
Which is fun.
Do you remember how you got into medieval history generally? I mean, how early in life that was?
When I was a graduate student at Chicago. I don't know. I read lots of things at various points, but the point at which I got involved as a hobby was I was a graduate student at Chicago. Various people in the local science fiction group knew about the SCA, which had been started a couple of years earlier, and some of us thought it would be fun to do a Midwest version of the Midwest part of the SCA, and so we created what ended up as the Middle Kingdom, which now has, I don't know, thousands of people in it, I suppose, and so I got interested in medieval cooking and in medieval Islamic history and in a bunch of other things that seemed to me to be fun.
Yeah.
But I don't remember. That is, my impression is there were people in England in the late 19th century who were interested in Iceland, and I've got a quote from one of them in my original Icelandic article.
Yeah, I know Tolkien was very into Iceland as well.
Yes, but not mainly interested in the legal system, I don't think.
Right.
But I should say, if anybody's interested in my stuff on Iceland, read Legal Systems rather than my old article on it, because there were some mistakes in that article, and I think I know more about it now. But anyway, so that's how I got into doing law and econ, and there was at least one person who wrote something on it later, taking a position inconsistent with mine, but I'm pretty sure that he was in part responding to what I had written, which he didn't like. So I don't think that there was a live discussion of that issue before I got involved in it.
Right. No.
Along similar lines, something that I was really happy with, my first published economics article was a theory of the size and shape of nations, in which also involved medieval stuff, looking at medieval stuff, historical stuff, basically, and it was a model that purported to explain the pattern of Europe of the European nations from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present. So it was a very ambitious piece, and I was happy with it. And many, many years later, I came across a review article somebody had done on the literature on size and shape of nations. The second article was by Jim Buchanan. The first article was by me.
Do you remember where that was published? Is that
Journal of JPE, the Journal of Political Economy.
Very cool. I'll have to check.
The story for the other story for that article is when I originally submitted it, it was rejected by George Stigler, who was the editor of the JPE at the time. Mm-hmm. And he rejected it on the ground that in order to be published in the JPE, I had to have some empirical tests of my theory. And he had some ideas which weren't workable of how to test it, but I thought of ways of testing it and did the tests and resubmitted it, and it got published. And I've been grateful to George ever since. The funny thing about it is that George was somebody I'd known since I was a child.
Right.
One of my father's best friends.
Well, speaking
but I was grateful to him because what I really learned was not that my theory was true. I got a little evidence that my theory was true, but not conclusive. What I really learned was that in order to test it, I had to think through much more clearly than I had what the theory was.
Right.
And that I thought was a very useful lesson.
Right. Well, I was curious about your relationship with Stigler and just generally. So other than, obviously your father, growing up, did you know the kind of Chicago economics world? Do you feel like you learned a lot from those other people, or was it more,
No, I learned a lot from my father,
mm-hmm.
Who I argued with a lot of the time about everything. And people like George Stigler were in the background.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Aaron Director was my uncle, who I was very close to.
Right.
But I don't remember discussing his work. I mean, I knew his stuff later when I was doing law and econ because he was one of the people who started it.
Right.
But I think I don't remember very much interaction along those lines. You haven't asked me any questions at all about my fiction.
Oh, that's true. I've not read any of it. Is it? How much does it directly intersect with your kind of legal and political work? Is it imagining institutions like that? My first novel, The Protagonist Society, is very loosely based on Saga period Iceland. Mm-hmm. It's not an island, but it's a semi-stateless society along similar lines. And the protagonist, among other things, is a storyteller, and I have a number of sort of references, which if you know the literature, you can recognize as part of a saga. My second novel, the first novel is not really a fantasy, even though Bain marketed it as a fantasy. It's really a historical novel with made-up history and geography. Mm-hmm. But all of the institutions and technology are real. And my second novel really is a fantasy. And the magic system in that, which I'm very fond of, is in part based on quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm.
That what I did was to create enough of a science of magic, as it were, so that I could create the illusion that the whole thing was there.
Right.
And I couldn't actually write the equivalent of price theory for the magic, but I could make it look as though I had read it, as it were. And that was fun. And the third novel is a sequel to the second novel, so it's the same system. But the second novel is also economic in the sense that what it started out being about was the magical version of the central planning fallacy. That it's a world where magic is very weak. And a particularly brilliant young mage figures out a way in which one mage can pull in the magical power of a whole bunch of others and funnel it through himself, and therefore do the kinds of things that Maj has always imagined doing. And it's not just Majas, actually, because in this world, everybody has magic. The Majas are the ones who have enough to explicitly use it. But magic is the reason why some people have a green thumb, even though they may not know that's why, and then other things of that sort. So we pull it in for everybody. And he is a well-intentioned, rather naive, very smart guy. And he thinks of all the great things that you can do this they couldn't do before. And the other protagonist, really the main protagonist, is an equally brilliant female student at the college where he's a professor. And he tries to recruit her into his project. He doesn't have this working yet. It's something he's working on. And her response is, will you have the permission of the people whose magic you're using? Well, I couldn't possibly. There'll be a whole lot of them. They wouldn't know. But he says, you're sheltered. You don't understand the things. Oh, I understand. My mother is a healer. I have seen men with gaping wounds that she has closed. And when you have taken her magic to end a flood or build a monument, what happens to the men she cannot heal? On whose hands is the blood, I think is the way she puts it. So basically, the central planning fallacy is this very plausible and convincing idea that if only there's all that stuff out there, all those resources, if only a sensible person had control of them, what wonderful things you could do. And there are three things wrong with it. One of them, which is she pointing out, is that those resources are already being used by the people who own them for their own purposes. So you deprive them of that. The second is the assumption that the person who does it will be a benevolent and good person. And that also gets illustrated. Basically, one of the professor's colleagues encourages him with the idea of ending up taking control of it, basically making himself ruler. And the third mistake, which I don't actually ever get into in the novel, is the idea that figuring out how to do it is easy, not realizing the enormous difficulty of the coordination problem for any society of any size. But that doesn't really come up. But so in that sense, that was about both my physics feeding into how I could do a reasonably plausible magic system and my economics feeding into.
Well, I want to ask
about, I guess in a sense, it also my political philosophy, because one of the things in the second novel that I did not plan, but that came up, was the issue of in what sense the end justifies the means.
Right.
Because, and the answer is, if enough is at stake, you will in fact be willing to do things that you would normally disapprove of.
Right. Very cool. You said that in Hyde Park you were part of a science fiction reading group, which is what turned you on to science fiction.
Not really a reading group; it was a club.
Okay.
At the university.
Okay.
Of students. At some point, I was part of a group that did readings of Lord of the Rings, and may have gone through all of it. I'm not sure, but we did certainly a lot of it. And I had to wait for The Two Towers to be published in England. That is, to be published at all, because I got onto it very, very early.
You remember the publication of The Two Towers, you're saying?
I remember having to wait for it to be published.
Right. Oh, wow.
My Uncle Aaron's wife, Catherine, introduced me to the fellowship.
Yeah.
And I didn't know her very well. I knew Aaron very well. And so I was an enthusiast for Lord of the Rings very, very early.
Yeah, that was in the early 50s, right? Or am I remembering?
Well, I was born in 1945.
Right.
So that was probably about 55, somewhere around there. Fits with it. And what I really remember from that reading was doing the scene with Sauron orcs and Saruman orcs, where they've captured this is some of the hobbits. And the people who did them, the person who did the Sauron orcs did them in a German accent. And the person who did the Saruman orcs did them in a Japanese accent. And it was very funny.
Right. Was it popular? Like, were other kids reading this at the time, or is it?
The first time when I encountered other people was in ninth grade in Palo Alto. We spent a year in Palo Alto when I was in ninth grade, and there was a group of kids in the ninth grade class who were Tolkien enthusiasts, and that's the first point. And I should be able to work out when that was. I must have been about 12, so it would have been about 57 or so, 56, somewhere around there.
Okay, so
that's the first point at which there were other Tolkien enthusiasts that I knew about.
Yeah, and was it did it feel like a pretty smooth growth through kind of your whole life? Because I grew up in the world where it was just like ubiquitous. Like everyone loved these. The movies were huge. Everyone my age watched the movies, loved the movies.
But that's the problem. The movies are not the book.
Right.
No, I saw the first of the movies, and it was better than I expected, but bad enough so that I didn't choose to see the others.
Really? You didn't watch any of the others?
No.
Yeah, that's I had that level of standards with the Hobbit movies because those were truly terrible. Those were the Peter Jackson Hobbit movies. Those were quite bad.
The two things that I remember upsetting me about the Fellowship movie, one of them was a scene where Arwen is sneaking up on Aragorn. She's playing ninja. Arwen is what, 800 years old? These are not teenagers.
Right.
These are very adult people, and they just wouldn't behave that way. And the other thing was the fight scene between Gandalf and Saruman, which is out of Star Wars, roughly.
Right.
And you could have done it right. We know what Saruman's power is. Saruman's power is his voice. You could have done that scene, if you're going to do the scene at all, with Saruman arguing for his position and the audience saying, yes, he's obviously right. Of course, Gandalf will go along. And then Gandalf somehow breaking the bubble. And then Saruman doing it again. Gandalf. That would have been really impressive. But this was just silly.
Yeah.
Those were the things that upset me enough, so I didn't.
Yeah. Were you bothered by cutting out Tom Bombadil too? That was another.
No. That is to say, it's unfortunate to cut him out. He's a neat part of the story. He gives a certain perspective to the whole thing. But they have limited amount of space, and a novel doesn't really fit in a movie.
Right.
And even three long movies, because it was one long novel, but three volumes. But I haven't read Lord of the Rings for a long time. Maybe I should reread it. I counted up at one time, and I decided I'd read it about 20 times. But but the last one would have been several years ago. So there are some good writers now. I think the most addictive writer that I've come across in recent years is Naomi Novik.
I don't know her.
The Scholomance series, which is a three-book series, and I have various reservations about it, but she is awfully good.
Okay.
The other person who's probably not writing anymore, I don't think, is C.J. Cherry, who I also think highly of.
I also don't know C.J. Cherry.
Cherryh.
Okay. Do you know them personally?
No. I've corresponded with her a long time ago about the fact that in one of her fantasy novels, she makes the point that carts are an important military resource. You've got two people who are allies, and they're fighting more or less the same war in different places. And the question of whether the carts that one of them uses get back to the other in time is a critical point of the plot. It turns out that the Magna Carta includes terms on carts.
And what are they? Or what does it say?
I'd have to go back, but basically, what are the conditions on which the crown can seize carts to use for military supplies? I remember correctly,
Right.
and I think I wrote her about that because I thought that was neat.
Yeah. All right. Well, I need to run, but thank you
Yeah, that's
so
fine.
much for taking the time. This has been
Right,
a
it
lot
was
of
fun.
fun. And recommend to everyone, legal systems very different from our own, the machinery of freedom. And I can't personally recommend your fiction, but I'm going to have to go read it now. And
Read it and see if you like it.
yeah, thanks
Right.
for talking.
Thank you.